Agora eu vou passar para a próxima apresentação. Jessica, hi. It's now I'm gonna share the floor with you. But first, I'll just present the title of your presentation. Jessica Beagle, é a Policy Lead na Global Climate and Health Alliance, e ela vai falar sobre os avanços, quais foram os avanços e retrocessos da, sobre CCNTs, quando a gente está pensando ou planejando, se preparando para a COP 30. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Danny. And it's really great to be here because I worked on NCDs when I started my career, so it's nice to come back to an NCDs forum now. As Danny said, I work with the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and a lot of the work that we do is thinking about how health can fit in to the UN climate negotiations, and also how it can drive more ambitious action, and that in turn delivers for health. So we know that the World Health Organization recognizes climate change as a leading threat to health of this century, and that includes non-communicable diseases. Climate change worsens outcomes for people that are living with non-communicable diseases, whether because of extreme heat and the impacts that that has on people with cardiovascular disease or diabetes or respiratory conditions, but also the impacts of climate change, whether that's flood or drought or famine, can cause forced displacement, which affects access to healthcare and to medicines that people with NCDs need, of course, on an ongoing basis. But even before we get to the outcomes of climate change, there are commonalities between climate change and NCDs and their causes. If we look at the way that energy sector is set up, fossil fuels are the leading driver of climate change. They also cause air pollution. Very red meat rich diets, very processed foods, all of those have higher emissions, so they cause NCDs, they cause climate change. And also motorized transport systems that reduce physical activity also have higher greenhouse gas emissions. So by acting on climate change, we are often choosing solutions that can really benefit health, but we're also reducing the risk for people that have NCDs. So it's a win-win-win situation for NCD prevention, NCD control, and for addressing climate change. At COP30, there will be probably well over 100 agenda items. COPs are really crazy in terms of the number of things that get discussed, but there are 4 themes that are really relevant for thinking about non-communicable diseases. One of those is mitigation, which is how can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? It's those that are causing us to rise to new temperatures. Adaptation, which is how can we strengthen systems, whether those are health systems or food systems, or water and sanitation systems, so that when those climate hazards happen, the impacts don't affect people, that those people are protected from the worst impacts. On just transitions, this is about how we do mitigation and adaptation at the same time and in a fair way. So how do we reduce emissions while also making communities more resilient? What are those, again, the win-win solutions? And finance, how do we pay for all of this? Because much like the healthcare finance landscape and the climate finance landscape is really, really stretched right now. So for mitigation, fossil fuels are the leading cause of climate change, and therefore the leading cause of the impacts on people living with NCDs from climate change. But even before fossil fuels have caused that climate change, they harm NCDs, they lead to increased NCD risk because of the processes of extracting the fossil fuels from the earth, and then the burning of those fossil fuels causes air, water, and soil pollution, which is dangerous both for fossil fuel work, for people that are employed by the fossil fuel industry, but also, of course, for communities that live near those fossil fuel extraction and combustion sites. And a lot of the diseases that result from that air, water, and soil pollution exposure are, of course, non-communicable diseases. There was some progress at COP28. It actually took 28 COPs for governments to talk about shifting away from fossil fuels, which says a lot about the influence that the industry has on the UNFCCC process, that we couldn't even mention fossil fuel phase out until 3 decades in. But finally, there was an agreement on the importance of moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy. However, even though that language is there, it's been really hard to move to discussions about implementation and how we make that commitment a reality. A lot of the politics that are at play there are because the global north has caused the vast majority of historical emissions, and they have profited from the activities that cause those emissions. And there is a principle in the UNFCCC space, and that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that says because the global north has made more emissions, they have to reduce their own emissions faster. And because they've profited from the activities that led to those emissions, that they have to finance action in parts of the world that are being more impacted by climate change. There is no objective way to do that, and a lot of the delay that we see in the UNFCCC process is because there is no obvious definition of what is fair, but it's sure to say that fair is developed countries doing more than they are currently doing. On adaptation, so strengthening systems, of course, we need action in the healthcare sector to protect people who are living with NCDs from the impacts of climate change, but we also need action in other sectors. So in terms of the healthcare sector, the Brazilian government is really leading on this year, and there will be a dedicated action plan on adaptation in the healthcare sector that will be launched at COP30, and that will be endorsed by many governments. It's been a really long build-up, a really long consultation period, and it's a really excellent plan. In addition, we see more of a cross-sectoral focus in a discussion called the Global Goal on Adaptation. And there are indicators that should be adopted at COP30 that measure adaptation progress in health, but also in food and poverty, and ecosystems and culture, and lots of other aspects that are linked to health, even if they are not explicitly about health in the title. I'm sorry for messing up the order of the slide, but of course, whether progress is made on any of those areas, on health, on water, on poverty, will depend on whether there is finance and whether there is technology transfer and whether there is capacity building. And what we're seeing is that a lot of global north countries are really opposed to providing those means of implementation, those tools for action, which will mean that we might be in danger of seeing very limited progress on health, food, and poverty that we're trying to measure. On just transition, so this is my slide before last. Thank you for bearing with the lack of interpretation. And I hope that my English is understandable. On just transitions, we can talk about moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but as we're doing that, it's not a just transition unless we're ensuring energy access along the way. Energy access is really important for health. Without energy access, we're not going to be able to power healthcare centres. And it's a barrier to education. And of course, if you have unhealthy energy access, then that's a really high risk for household air pollution. There are 3.2 million deaths every year that happen due to household air pollution from unclean cooking and heating and lighting. And the fossil fuel industry has not delivered the solutions that people need for clean household energy access. But often fossil fuels require really extensive national infrastructure, whereas it's possible to install a local renewable energy grid that relies on wind power or solar power, rather than having really long, extensive gas pipes or oil transport. So renewable energy could be a really good way to bring energy access to ways where the fossil fuels have failed to do that. As we're making transitions, we hope that there will be less jobs in fossil fuels and more jobs in renewable energy. But that doesn't automatically mean that somebody that has had a job in fossil fuels can just switch. They need training, because that job security is such a key social determinant of health, because income and poverty and NCD risk are all linked. At COP30, one of the discussions that will happen is for governments to agree on the definition of what a just transition looks like. And at the moment in the draft text, there is mention of the right to health and the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment, both of which, of course, are really key. On finance, this should actually say at COP29 in Baku, rather than COP28 in Dubai, Global South countries requested $1.3 million to support climate action, but developed countries were only willing to commit 300 billion, so about a quarter of what was requested. And that really limits the level of climate action that can be taken to protect non-communicable diseases from the effects of climate change. As well as the quantity of the finance, the quality is also really important. A lot of climate finance at the moment is based on loans, and when loans have high interest rates, they increase debt, and the poorest countries in the world are already spending more on repaying that debt than they are on healthcare and education and infrastructure combined. So we need to think about the quality and the quantity. At the same time, we hear that there is not enough money, but there was $700 trillion that was spent on fossil fuel subsidies in 2022. About 1.2 trillion of those were invested directly in fossil fuels, and the remaining 5.8 trillion were because of the costs of the use of those fossil fuels. So a lot of those would have been health costs. But just as a comparison, to think about the level of money that is invested in fossil fuels, and it's a huge percentage of global GDP, I think 5 or 6 or 7, I can't remember which percent, but we don't spend that much money on many other things. But universal health coverage would cost $1 trillion each year, and we spend that on fossil fuels instead, when we could be spending it on renewable energy and avoiding those health impacts that fossil fuels then cost. And if we charged for fossil fuels according to what they actually cost, the health harms that they cause, the environmental harms that they cause, the shift away from fossil fuels that would happen would be enough to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and would also prevent 1.6 million deaths every year from air pollution, and those are statistics by the IMF. And that's the end of what I've got to talk about today, but really looking forward to the rest of the discussion, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And it's striking to see how much power and inequality is so strong in this environmental agenda, and that relates to what we were hearing from Caroline. Thank you so much.